We have a fun topic today looking at rusty crayfish removals, in particular, protecting around wild rice beds. And it's fun. I think this is the first time that we've had a crayfish talk so far in the series. So exciting to bring in a new taxa to the group. I just have a couple of housekeeping items for you, and then I will welcome our guests and they can take over and share their screen. We do have a Q&A system called Slido that we'll be using. You can enter in your questions at any point, but we'll have Q&A at the end. So you can go to slido.com and the event code is Rusty. And I'll drop that into chat after a bit, and we'll also have the slide up again so you can see that once we enter Q&A. But if you have questions along the way and want to enter them so you don't forget, you can use that. We'll also monitor chat, and if you don't get in there and they end up in chat instead, Michelle is here offering tech support, and we'll also be um, dropping those over to Slido for us. We are also recording today's session, so if there's something you want to come back and visit or someone that you want to share today's webinar with, that'll be up on our YouTube channel later. It usually takes a week or so to get the transcriptions done and then to get that live, but it'll be up there, so you can watch for that on YouTube. And since you're registered, you'll get a notification when that's ready. Everyone will be muted for the duration of the webinar, so if you do have questions, go ahead and use that Slido tool, or again, put them in the chat. And if you're having any kind of tech support issues, you can also use the chat feature there, and Michelle will be monitoring and can help you with that. That is all that I have for the housekeeping items. So I'm going to introduce Val Brady and Brennan Pederson here. They're our guest speakers to share all about the work that they've been doing around the rusty crayfish management. So I'll turn it over to you two.
All right, thanks, Megan. So I'm Valerie Brady. I am the Water Research Group leader at the Natural Resources Research Institute. And this project was not my idea. This project was the idea of Josh Dumke, who used to work for us, and Tyler Casper, formerly at 1854 Treaty Authority. So both of them have now left their positions after we got the project funded and going, although they both stuck around for the first year or so of the project and made sure it all got started and running well before they left for other things. So that left me and Brennan to take over and finish it off. And I do have to say that Brennan has done a terrific job. He was the summer technician on the first year of the project, and so learned everything under Josh and Tyler. And then when Josh left, we just told Brennan that he had to take it over and run the field part of it, which he did very well. So it's been a very interesting project. We haven't done anything like this before. And Brennan's going to tell you our results. And should you be interested in trapping crayfish yourself, he's got the whole how-to on how to do that. So Brennan, turning it over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. Yeah, like Val said, my name's Brennan. Today I'm going to be talking to you about MASERC Subproject 46, which was titled Effective Rusty Crayfish Removals to Protect Wild Rice. Like Val mentioned, this project was started by Josh Dumke from NRRI and Tyler Caspar from the 1854 Treaty Authority, and then was taken over by Val as the PI and Matt Santo as the co-PI. But this project involved a lot of people and different agencies, which you can see on the screen now on this slide. I'll talk more about those at the end, but this was a big joint fieldwork project that a lot of people contributed to. To start off with a little bit of background about rusty crayfish in northeastern Minnesota. Rusty crayfish are native to the Ohio River Basin, and they were spread kind of up northwest throughout the Midwest by anglers primarily. But here's a picture of what a rusty crayfish looks like at the top of the slide here. You can see where they get their namesake from. They have this trademark rusty red, reddish brown spot that you can find on each side of their carapace, and that's the best way to identify rusty crayfish. There's about 75 lakes between St. Louis, Lake, and Cook counties here in northeastern Minnesota that are infested with rusty crayfish. And then 35 of those lakes also host wild rice, as listed by 1854 Treaty Authority. You can see on the map there, those white stars are the different lakes that we visited for this project and where we trapped crayfish. And then, of course, there's home base in Duluth at the tip of Lake Superior. Rusty crayfish are known to graze on submerged aquatic vegetation, including wild rice. And so we want to see if we can protect wild rice. Wild rice is culturally and ecologically important in Minnesota. Wild rice is very interesting. It provides habitat for juvenile fish species and also lots of macroinvertebrates. It improves water quality and it also stabilizes wetland soils, and which helps, buffer against erosion. Wild rice is also very culturally important. It serves as a food source for both humans and animals, but we have many indigenous communities that reside in Minnesota that utilize wild rice every year as a food source. So we want to make sure it sticks around. Um, Wild rice is the most vulnerable to grazing from rusty crayfish early in the summer, when the rice is still kind of growing up throughout the water column, kind of in May and June. And then when that rice grows enough and it reaches its floating and emergent stages later in the summer, it's less vulnerable to rusty crayfish. This, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's unfortunately whole lake eradication of rusty crayfish is not currently possible without also harming other native species, things like chemical treatments. We just can't get specific enough to target only rusty crayfish. So that leaves us with the best current strategy for population control in infested lakes, which is to try to remove enough individuals to control the population size. And this is typically done through trapping. You can see there's a couple of the different trap types that we used in this project, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. This project had a couple main goals and then a third goal that's not on the screen that I'll talk about. First being, we wanted to determine effective trap types and bait types for rusty crayfish removal near sensitive vegetation, such as wild rice. And then we also wanted to see if we could determine the size of the trapping area required to protect sensitive wild rice beds from rusty crayfish. And we did this through a mark and recapture study where we were generating or trying to see how far the crayfish were traveling in between our visits. And then the third goal that's not on the screen, but we wanted to mention, and it was important to us, was that we wanted to use methods for this project and for catching crayfish that anybody in the state of Minnesota could use to also trap crayfish if they so wish. So we went to 3 different lakes in 2023 and revisited some of those lakes in 2024, but 3 lakes in 2023 and 2024. Each lake was sampled twice per year. The first visit to each lake occurred in the early summer in May or June, when that rice is most vulnerable to grazing by rusty crayfish. And so we were trying to remove as many crayfish as we could in that vulnerable period, and help be immediately protective for the wild rice. And then we went back to each lake later in the summer in July and August for a second visit, which has kind of had the goal of being more proactively protective. Crayfish are more active and forage more in warm water. So when the water is the warmest in that late summer time is when you can catch the most crayfish, and that's going to be proactively protective and help reduce the pressure that the crayfish are able to exert on next year's crop of wild rice growth. So on each lake, this is what our study area would look like. We had focusing on one area of sensitive vegetation or a wild rice bed. They were all wild rice beds in our cases, but we had 2 main zones. The removal area is centered right around the sensitive vegetation that we're focusing on. And this is where we would test the different trap and bait types. And this is where we were trying to remove as many rusty crayfish as possible to try to protect that wild rice. And then the second trapping area for this study was the mark and release area. This is where we were trying to generate our travel distance data on the crayfish. You can see that there are these groups of X's placed at specific spots outside of the removal area. This is where we would release the crayfish, but I'll talk more about that in a little bit. During each visit to each lake, the traps were set overnight. We would usually get there on a Monday afternoon and set traps, leave them overnight, and then check the following day. And we'd repeat that process for 3 nights. So we'd get there on a Monday, leave on a Thursday afternoon. And we did this for 2 trips, once in the early summer, once in the late summer on each lake. Here are the 3 different bait types and trap types that we tested in 2023. So you can see trap A here's kind of our standard sized wire mesh. They're marketed as minnow traps. They double equally as well as crayfish traps, but it's just a trap that has funneled entrances for the crayfish to enter. Trap B is an extra large version of that wire mesh crayfish trap. We had some anecdotal stories before starting this project that if the traps got too full, the crayfish actually would be able to kind of crawl over the top of each other and get back to the funnel entrances on the traps and actually escape. We didn't want that to happen, so we incorporated an extra large version in the 2023 portion of the study. And then the third type of trap you can see on the far right there, letter C, is our refuge shelter. We hesitate to call it a trap because there's nothing actually keeping the crayfish in there, but we were using the refuge shelter for two main reasons. One, we wanted to see if a non-baited alternative could provide the same or similar catch rates for crayfish as the baited traps, because if you don't have to use bait, that's great. The other main reason we were using refuge shelters is because there was some literature that came out of Europe that said or reported that the refuge shelters are a little bit better at catching a higher proportion of female crayfish. And when you're engaging in population control, especially for crayfish, rusty crayfish, removing the females is going to be the most important target, I guess. The baited traps, there is literature that states that these are usually pretty skewed heavily towards catching a lot of males. So we wanted to see if we catch more females. We deployed 18 of each of these trap types in the removal area close to the sensitive vegetation. And then we also tested 3 different types of bait in the baited traps in 2023. Those baits were hot dogs, like a wet cat food that would come in like a plastic cup. And then we also tested frozen smelt. So that's 2023. We made some changes for the 2024 portion of this study. First change being that we dropped the extra large traps from the study. I'll touch more on this when we get to the results, but we are catching the similar numbers of crayfish in the standard and the extra large version of the baited traps. And that tells us that the crayfish weren't escaping from the standard size trap, so we don't need to use the big one. We kept the refuge shelters in for 2024, and we also simplified our bait choice. Like I said, we have some results coming up later, but the hot dogs performed just as well as the other kinds of bait, and they're like the cheapest and easiest to use. So it's going to be the best option for most people. Now, I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about what we would do with the crayfish that we catch in each of these 2 main areas of our study. First off, I'm going to talk about what we would do with crayfish we catch near the wild rice in the removal area. So when we would pull up traps and empty the traps, the crayfish would get dumped into a sorting box, which you can see pictures of on this slide here. And the idea behind this sorting box is that it would sort the crayfish by size. Basically, the small crayfish would work their way around the tray and fall through the slots into the bottom of the plastic bin, while the large crayfish stayed on top. That'll be important in a minute, but we wanted the large crayfish because those are the ones that we were actually going to be marking and releasing. We also sexed each crayfish, and any native crayfish that we identified were released back into the lake, but the rusty crayfish came with us and did not go back into the lake, except for a few exceptions. Moving on to the mark and release area. As a reminder, this is where we were this is where we were trying to generate our travel distance data to see how far the crayfish were moving. And these pods are important, these groups of X's. A pod is just 3 baited traps placed close together to try to catch as many crayfish as possible. This is where we would release all the marked crayfish, and they were set at specific distances outside of the removal area, so we always knew where the crayfish were starting from. So when we were processing crayfish in the mark and release area, we also sorted them by size through the grading box, but we were looking for the large crayfish because the large crayfish are the ones that we were going to mark and release. And each spot where we released crayfish, each of those groups of X's, on the shoreline had its own specific code that was only used for that location. And that would allow us to tell where these recaptured crayfish came from when we would get them in different traps in different spots around the lake. And then we'd be able to plot those 2 points on a map and see how far the crayfish moved in a linear distance. I'd also like to mention that we only marked and released crayfish during the first visit to each of the lakes. And in the second visit to each lake later in the summer, we would take all of the rusty crayfish with us no matter what, whether they were bearing a mark or not. We didn't release any invasive rusty crayfish during the second trip of the study. So it might be kind of hard to tell, but the picture on the right side of this slide is showing a freshly marked crayfish. You can see a little bit of a pinhole in the center lobe of the tail and also the left middle lobe of the tail there. And then you can see a picture of one of our summer technicians actually marking the crayfish on the left side of the screen. To mark the crayfish, we would take a small pin and just poke holes through the lobes of the tail in that kind of coded arrangement based on where we were releasing them. And so it was the best way to do it in a moving boat. It was quick for marking a lot of crayfish. It's not very harmful to the crayfish. It's not lethal at all. And this marking procedure would persist through at least one molt in case the crayfish molt between our first and second visit. So we can still tell that it was a marked crayfish. Okay, that's kind of the background of the project and the setup and how we would catch and process our crayfish. Now I want to talk a little bit about what we found and the results. So you can see there's a full boat of crayfish traps there. We were putting out a lot of traps in these lakes. And there's kind of our prime target on the right side. That is a rusty crayfish carrying eggs, a female. Those are the ones that we want to get out of the lakes. Okay, this first graph is showing our total crayfish catch in each lake by species over the course of both summers of the project. You can see on the bottom left there, we captured almost 34,000 crayfish over the course of this study. So we were getting a lot of crayfish. The vast majority of these crayfish are invasive rusty crayfish. You can see we were getting a lot of our crayfish from Caribou Lake and then Tofty Lake in 2024. But one other thing that's important to note about this graph is you can see in Caribou Lake, in Dumbbell Lake, and in Tofty Lake, you can see the crayfish populations are largely almost completely dominated by invasive rusty crayfish. There's a small group or population of native calico crayfish kind of holding on in Tofty Lake. But this is a great visual to demonstrate how dominant rusty crayfish are and how they can just kind of overwhelm our native crayfish when they get into new lakes. Moving on from the total crayfish catch, this is showing us how well each of the different bait types we tested in 2023 did. We found that rusty crayfish are not picky, which is great news. But on the left side, on the y-axis, this is showing how many crayfish were caught per trap that was using each respective bait type every 24 hours. You can see on the left side of the x-axis, C1, C2, and C3 are actually the different flavors of cat food that we were trying. We tested 3 different flavors, and then fish and hot dogs are pretty self-explanatory. But the most important thing to take away from this graph is that there's no bait that really performs significantly better than the other. They all performed about the same. You can see some outliers from the fish and the hot dogs, but the rusty crayfish didn't seem to care, which is also why we decided to drop the other 2 bait types from the 2024 portion of the study. Given that the hot dogs were the most readily available bait, they're the cheapest out of the 3. They're the easiest to work with as well. Cat food and frozen smelt both get messy and smelly in the boat, and hot dogs don't get as bad. Moving on from the bait, here are our results from the different trap types that we tested in 2023. So there's 2 main things to note about this graph. You can see just how poorly the refuge traps performed in terms of catching crayfish compared to the baited traps. Once again, we're looking at crayfish caught per trap type every 24 hours. And this difference between the refuge traps and the standard traps is almost a 50x magnitude of a difference. It was kind of crazy. So the refuge traps unfortunately are kind of a bust. We're not going to recommend people use those. But the other important thing to note about this graph is that the standard and the XL baited traps don't show a significant difference in the number of crayfish they were catching in 24 hours. And like I said a little earlier in this presentation, that tells us that the crayfish were not escaping from the standard size traps and that the extra large size is not really warranted for this kind of an application. And then this is the last graph I'm going to throw at the audience, but this graph is just showing the proportion of the two sexes of crayfish that we would catch in each different trap type. So I'll remind you, the pods are just groups of 3 baited traps placed in close proximity to each other. And then we have the standard traps as well. But we can see in the baited traps that there is a bias. They are skewed towards catching males. We did see the closest to equal ratio of male to female crayfish caught in the refuge traps or the refuge shelters. But once again, they caught so few crayfish overall that we actually ended up catching more total female crayfish in the baited traps, despite them being skewed towards catching more males. So just go with the baited traps is what we're saying, basically. And then here is the data generated from all the crayfish that we released and then recaptured at a different spot in the lake. We can see that crayfish are capable of moving quite far. This was surprising to us. We can see the farthest a crayfish moved was almost 630 meters in Caribou Lake. And that crayfish was marked and released in June and then recaptured later in August. So there was almost 2 months for that crayfish to move around. But we did have some outlier crayfish that moved very far overnight, which I'll talk about in just a second. But you can see crayfish are not afraid to move a couple hundred meters. That's no big deal to them, which was surprising to us. And it's going to make it hard to set up any sort of a meaningful zone of depletion or perimeter of traps around the area you're trying to protect. To give a little bit better of a visual of the crayfish moving around, this is an overhead view of Caribou Lake. And this is the bay that we are trapping in. It's on the northeastern side of the lake, and this lake is by Lutsen, Minnesota. But we can see here's that longest traveled crayfish, moved 630 meters nearly across the bay. But what's almost more interesting is this crayfish on the white line here that moved almost 440 meters overnight. We know it moved that far overnight because we came and marked that crayfish on the Tuesday that we came to the lake when we first checked the traps. And then on the next day, it was all the way across the bay in a different trap over here. Now, there's a little bit of a caveat. These are just the linear distances of that these crayfish could have moved to these new spots. Oh, sorry. Wow, how did I do that? Oh, geez. There, sorry. These are just the linear distances that these crayfish could have moved. It's unlikely that they actually moved in linear distances in linear straight lines like this, especially because this bay gets quite deep in the middle. It gets almost 30 feet deep. So what's more likely the case is that these crayfish actually traveled around the perimeter in the shallow water, kind of around the edge of the bay to end up to their new spot where we captured them again, which would be an even farther distance that they were able to travel. So now we kind of got through our results and observations. These are going to be our recommendations for anybody that's interested in trying to trap crayfish for themselves. So standard baited traps were the best by far. The refuge shelters just couldn't stack up to the numbers that the baited traps were able to produce. We also did widen the openings on the funnel entrances for the baited traps to allow the crayfish better access to the traps. And I'll talk about that more in a second. The bait choice didn't matter very much, actually at all. All the baits we tested performed equally well, but we think that the bait that you choose should just leave a good scent trail and it will likely work well. Like I said earlier, we're going to recommend people using hot dogs for bait because they're really cheap. really easily available, and they're also an effective bait and easy to use. We're going to recommend trapping in the late spring or in the early summer as the water starts to warm up, and then throughout the summer as much as possible. We did not see a decrease in the catch rate or the number of crayfish we were catching over the course of our visits to these lakes. So that tells us that the effort we were putting in wasn't enough to really deplete that crayfish population. And as we saw, the crayfish can move large distances. So it's going to be hard to prevent new crayfish from filling in. And that's why we're going to recommend trapping immediately adjacent to the sensitive areas, because the crayfish are willing and able to travel far. It's the best idea is just to trap right where you want to protect from rusty crayfish. Okay, following those recommendations, I'm going to kind of go through some of the most essential steps, kind of walk through everybody how you might go about trapping crayfish using our methods. To start off, and before I get into this, I'd like to just say as a reminder, one focus of this study was to use methods that anybody in the state of Minnesota could use to trap rusty crayfish. With that said, here are some of the essential materials. You're going to need traps, of course. The wire mesh, like I said, they're marketed as minnow traps, but they double as crayfish traps just fine. They're sold in nearly every sporting goods stores. I've seen them at hardware stores, and they're also readily available online. It used to be cheaper. Now a lot of them are around $20. You can still find some for around $15 some places. You need a buoy to mark your traps. Those are usually sold at the same places and very cheap. Baits, of course. We're going to recommend hot dogs because they're really easy. You need some sort of tether to tether the buoy to the trap. We used nylon rope, and that worked great for us, but you could use paracord or whatever else you have lying around, as long as it's long enough. And then one thing that is important is it is actually Minnesota state law that each trap is marked with a tag no smaller than 1 by 3 inches, and that tag has to have the user's name and address on it for identification purposes. And we just ordered these little metal custom stamped tags online. They weren't very expensive. I don't know off the top of my head how expensive they were, though. Okay, now that you have all of the stuff that you need to trap, you need to do a little bit of preparation before you deploy these traps. The most important thing that we did in this aspect is to widen the entrances to 1.5 inches in diameter, which is the maximum width allowed in Minnesota. And this allows the crayfish better access to the traps, especially the larger crayfish. And to do this, we just used a wooden dowel that was 1.5 inches across. We just pushed it through the wire mesh, through the funnel opening, just to make it wider for the crayfish. Once you have the entrances widened, you're going to need some lengths of rope to attach the buoy to the trap. It's a good idea to pre-cut all these lengths of rope because it can get kind of difficult or annoying to do it while you're on the water trying to set the trap. If you have an idea of where you want to trap and have an estimate of that depth, that's great. You can cut the lengths of rope to that depth, but it's important to leave a couple feet of buffer to account for waves or stormy weather or soft sediment. Maybe the trap sinks into the sediment a little bit, because you don't want that buoy to get dragged under the waves or under the water and not be visible to boaters or other recreationalists on the water. For this study, we just cut a bunch of 5 and 10 foot lengths of nylon rope, and that was, very sufficient for at least 90% of the traps that we were setting for this study. After that, you can kind of put all the traps together. So you tie off the buoy to the trap. And then in this case, the rope is tied off to the clip of the trap that holds it closed. We were just doing overhand knots, or also called half hitch knots. And we were just typically doing 3 or 4 of those. That was sufficient for us. You don't need to know any fancy knots. These traps aren't very heavy. And we only had one time throughout the course of the project that a buoy line came loose from a trap and we had to kind of go fishing for it. But you also need to fix the tag to the trap before you deploy them in the water. Okay, that's all the preparation. So the traps should be ready to go now. They have widened entrances, they have buoys and ropes, and a tag on them. Now we're ready to deploy just about. So like we said, we're going to recommend targeting areas immediately adjacent to sensitive vegetation or whatever you're trying to protect, because crayfish can move around. Just the best idea is going to be putting the traps where you want to protect stuff. And crayfish are most active in the warm water. As the water warms up, they get more and more active and they forage more. So those peak summer months are going to be where you're going to be able to catch the most crayfish. We found trapping is effective in depths from 1 to 15 feet of water. We didn't really set traps deeper than this very often, and we never set traps more than 5 meters deep. This is because we were focusing on trapping near sensitive vegetation, and all of our vegetation was growing in shallow water. Also, crayfish like shallow water. They come up shallow at night, in the dark. One thing I wanted to touch on before moving on is that we use bait pills to ensure some of the bait actually remains in the trap until you return to check the trap. This isn't essential, but if you don't use a bait pill and you get a lot of crayfish in the trap, they will eat a whole hot dog or a whole smelt or whatever you put in there. They will eat it all. There were many times that we came back to no hot dog in the trap besides what was in the bait pill, or just a spine of a frozen smelt remaining as evidence of the crayfish eating the smelt. So it could be helpful to catch more crayfish, but not essential. When you're actually deploying the traps in the water, it's a good idea to lower the trap slowly to the bottom of the lake, and you want to make sure that you're holding on to the buoy end of the rope in case the buoy tether is too short, or maybe the trap shifts around a little bit on the bottom. Like I said before, you don't want that buoy to getting pulled under the waves so it's not visible to other people on the water. If possible as well, and this is also why it's a great idea to trap in shallow water. You want to be able to make sure that the trap sits flat on the bottom of the lake with both funnel entrances exposed to the crayfish. And then we suggest placing one trap every 30 feet. There is actually some literature that studied the effective radius of a baited crayfish trap, and that literature said about 10 to 12 meters is good, or is where the crayfish are able to be drawn into the trap. So placing one trap every 30 feet maximizes the amount of water that you can cover with a minimal number of traps. Finally, checking traps. Traps should be left overnight, because crayfish are active overnight and they come up shallow and are, available to trap overnight. But the traps must be checked once every 24 hours. That is actually Minnesota state law. When you are grabbing traps or grabbing buoys, it's a good idea to lift the trap smoothly off the bottom while holding the buoy line and not the buoy itself, in case they're not loosened over time. That was how we lost, or not lost, but that's how one of our traps got loose, grabbing the buoy, not the line, and we had to go fishing for it. And then when you have the crayfish traps, just empty them into whatever receptacle you're using. A plastic tote like what we used was good, or like a 5-gallon bucket is great, but you do need something with high walls, maybe 8 to 10 to 12 inches tall, because crayfish are very impressive escape artists. They'll kind of pile up on each other until one can reach the top lip and pull itself over. And there were many times throughout the course of this study that we thought we had all crayfish accounted for just to see one crawling across the bottom deck of the boat that somehow escaped. If you're going to be resetting the traps, it's a good idea to check the knots and connection points to make sure everything is solid. And then, of course, what do you do with the crayfish? If you want to dispatch them or euthanize them, the most humane way to do that is to freeze them in a freezer overnight. So place the crayfish in a sealed bag overnight in the freezer. And then once the crayfish are frozen, you can either throw them out in that sealed bag. I recommend waiting until garbage day, or else it might get a little bit smelly. You can also use them for compost or bury them for fertilizer. That's legal if they're frozen. And I know a couple of people who have done this, but fair warning, if you decide to do that, they are great attractants for scavengers such as raccoons, possums, and bears. And then the third option, which is the most fun and my favorite option, is you can actually eat crayfish. They provide good table fare, and it's a fun thing to do as a family for sure. A couple additional tips. Like I said at the start of this presentation, the best way to quickly ID a rusty crayfish in the field is to look for that rusty red spot that's going to be on each side of their carapace. And then if you're trapping crayfish, you're going to have to pick up a few of them, likely. And so you want to do that without getting pinched, of course. And the best way to not get pinched is to kind of grab them behind the head and behind their pinchers on either side of the body with your two fingers. They have a tough time kind of reaching behind their head. They can't really get you there. So you're mostly safe if you pick them up that way. To kind of close out, now that I talked about kind of the essential steps you might want to take or things you want to consider when pursuing crayfish trapping, here are a few of the notable regulations in Minnesota for crayfish trapping. First and foremost, you must possess a valid Minnesota fishing license to trap crayfish in Minnesota. There is a possession limit of 25 pounds of whole crayfish unless you get a commercial permit. And there is actually a season for crayfish trapping as well, which runs from April 1st to November 30th each year. We talked about the trap entrances not being larger than 1.5 inches and talked about each trap needing a tag. But one thing I haven't touched on yet is there is also a legal size of crayfish that you're legally allowed to take for personal use. And they have to be 1 inch long, basically from their snout. There's a little bony protrusion that comes out between their antenna. You measure from that to the tip of their tail. And if they're 1 inch or bigger, that's great. You can take them. But all crayfish smaller than that have to go back, even if they're invasive, which I find strange, but I double checked. And then, of course, traps must be checked every 24 hours. If you want to learn more, if you can just search up Minnesota crayfish regulations online, and the DNR's information page for crayfish will come up. And then that URL at the bottom is also a link to that crayfish page. To kind of wrap things up, like, what are the incentives for trapping crayfish? Why would I do this? Why should I go do this on my local lake? I mean, besides the fact that removing rusty crayfish can help reduce their negative effects on aquatic ecosystems, such as uprooting and grazing and destroying aquatic vegetation and overwhelming our native crayfish populations. But perhaps my favorite thing about rusty crayfish is that they present an opportunity for quality table fare. They're good. I think they taste like shrimp. I'm a Norwegian, so my family dips everything in butter. They're great dipped in butter. And they also get bigger than our native crayfish. So you get more of a meal from the invasives than you would the natives. And then on the bottom left of this slide, we do have a website dedicated to this project and the results. You can see the URL there, or you can just search up Macerc rusty crayfish and it'll come up. And that website is where we are going to be adding kind of a full instructions document on how to trap crayfish based on the methods that we used for this study. To kind of wrap things up, these are all the people that were involved in either the field work or the data analysis for this project. This was a really collaborative joint effort. There was a lot of people involved. Besides the PIs, I'd like to mention Liz Anderson and Paul Trigstad from Lake County, Amanda Weberg from Cook County, and Hannah Hill from the U.S. Forest Service, in addition to Matt Santo. These people were on all of the field trips, or the vast majority of them, in their respective jurisdictions, helping us trap crayfish when we visited their lakes. And then also Paul Jeffrey, Holly Wellard Kelly, and Amber Alseth were extremely helpful in actually getting this data analyzed and doing the statistical analysis for this project. Lastly, I want to recognize the funders of this project, which was the Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund. And then this project was selected for funding by the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. So thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions from the audience now.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing, Brennan. I am going to take over the screen one more time so that everyone has the code. So as a reminder, we have Slido up and running to manage Q&A, I see there's a number of questions in there already. So you can go to that website, use event code RUSTY, and it'll take you there. You can also upvote questions. So if there's one you really want to see answered, then you can upvote it to kind of move it towards the top. If it's not working for you or you'd rather not go to that site, that's just fine. Go ahead and put your question into chat and Michelle will move it over for you so I still see it from my moderator side. The first question for you is there's a couple of parts to it. The first one is wondering about how the trapping work might continue. And I think you touched on how crayfish are used or disposed of or if they can be eaten, but that was the second half of the question.
Okay. Yeah, so the idea for kind of future work with these methods would be to try to work with a lake association or another management group, potentially a tribal group, to try to see how well they can implement our methods that we used here in their different bodies of water. Like I said, a big focus of this project was trying to use methods that are going to be available to everybody. So I think that would be the next step, is to try to just test how well either a lake association or a different management group can follow these methods and see what kind of success they can have on their own. And then
we should note that we know of some lake associations that have actually hired commercial trappers to help them manage rusty crayfish populations. And of course, a commercial trapper who's getting paid can put a lot of effort into it, but they do catch, like, I don't know, hundreds of pounds of crayfish in some of these lakes over the course of a summer.
Yes. Yeah. There was a commercial trapper operating on one of our study lakes who was able to remove, I think, 1,100 pounds of crayfish and over 40,000 individual crayfish from one lake over the course of the summer.
Great. Okay. Next question is about rusty crayfish and wondering, do they tend to remove more vegetation or is it just that when they're invasive or have higher populations that's how they're having a big impact on the vegetation?
So I think it's kind of a yes to both. Usually when rusties get into a lake or a lake system, we see kind of this massive proliferation or explosion of rusty crayfish populations. And oftentimes that is contributing to the increase in vegetation destruction. But there is also some literature that suggests that rusty crayfish do need to eat more and do consume more biomass than our native crayfish counterparts. So yeah, they just need more resources. They're going to eat more. They are just a little bit more destructive. It seems our native crayfish do the same thing, but not at a level that is like unbalanced within the ecosystem, if that makes sense.
And rusties are bigger,
Yes.
so they can take, bigger chunks. And of course, there's that I need to eat more because I'm bigger.
Great. Okay, and then maybe following along those same lines, do you know how crayfish compare to other animals that could infect manumin? And are there other factors impacting early season growth, like seed viability or seeds that were eaten the previous year?
You want me to take this one?
Sure. I mean, you know more than I do about this.
Well, so, wild rice being an annual plant, there are so many factors that go into what the next year's bed or this year's bed is going to look like. And so, yes, it's all in there together. And of course, I don't think that the crayfish are doing seed predation, but of course there'd be fewer seeds if the crayfish have been taking out the wild rice. They may also be stirring up the substrate more, which can affect wild rice ability to germinate or just to stay rooted in that very flocculent vegetation. Flocculent sediment. So it's all in the mix together, and it's just one more stressor that wild rice are facing. If they do manage to germinate, then you've got this mowing machines that come along and just mow them all down. And the 1854 Treaty Authority, how we got the idea for this project is that 1854 Treaty Authority did a little experiment, exclosure, where they excluded crayfish from some wild rice and then put rusty crayfish in an enclosure with wild rice and really saw the devastation basically that a reasonably high density of rusty crayfish could cause to wild rice in this enclosure exclosure experiment, which is how we got the idea to see, okay, if they can damage wild rice, what can we do to protect wild rice?
Okay. One more question about crayfish in general. And I think this came in before you shared the slide about which species you were finding in the traps, but wondering about what you saw for native crayfish, if those ones are also affecting wild rice. And I'm going to add my own question onto here too, but do you happen to know, like you had that slide up that had the different numbers of rusties found in each lake, and in some where there were still like at least a, a noticeable portion of native left. Do you know how long rusties were present in each of those lakes, and is that why some maybe had natives that compared to others?
Yeah, so the first part, talking about if native crayfish are also detrimental to wild rice. I don't know for certain. I suspect they will graze wild rice, just like rusty crayfish. I don't see why they wouldn't. But like we said, for another question, the rusty crayfish often experience a population explosion when they first get into a lake, or and they or not sorry, or and they also are bigger and eat more than the native crayfish. So I think the understanding is that the native crayfish will, you know, participate in some of this grazing activity, but it's not to the level that the rusty crayfish will. And so it's not a cumulative detrimental impact to the rice year after year after year, if that makes sense. Um, and then to tackle the
And
second
you want to
part,
list the species we were finding?
what did you say, Val? Sorry.
Oh, they wanted to know the species we were finding.
Yeah, so there's like three species of crayfish that we were commonly finding, in addition to the rusty crayfish in these lakes. When we did get native crayfish, we would get northern clear water crayfish. That was perhaps our most common. Um, and then we would get a lot of calico crayfish as well. And calico crayfish have a little bit different habitat preference. They're more typically found in vegetation and in softer sediment, and are actually a burrowing crayfish. Um, and then the third type is called a virile crayfish, which looks pretty similar to rusty crayfish, and they get almost as big, but they're missing the rusty spots, of course, on each side of the carapace. And then trying to answer the question about maybe if there's some native crayfish left in the lake, is that a newer infestation? It's hard to say. I would suspect so. We do know one of our project partners, Hannah Hill for the U.S. Forest Service, was actually the one who first documented rusty crayfish in Caribou Lake, and she found rusty crayfish in Caribou Lake, I think in 2020 or 2021. Now, that's not to say they weren't in there for potentially years before that, but that was not a long amount of time, and those rusty crayfish in Caribou Lake were completely dominant. Of the crayfish species we found in Caribou Lake. And if you want to take Tofty Lake for an example, which is the one lake where we did see a little bit of a native population of calico crayfish hanging on. I don't know when that infestation was discovered, but I suspect it's newer than the other lakes that we were on, where we were catching rusty crayfish and almost only rusty crayfish and not really any other native crayfish.
Great. Thank you. I know I put a bunch of questions into
That's
one
okay.
there. I'm going to make another attempt to combine questions here because there's at least two that I see about baits. There's one half is wondering about why selecting meat for the bait versus plants if they typically eat plants. This person had heard of broccoli as a effective trap, and then combine that in with a group who's using dog food instead, and they're wondering, what led to the selections that you had.
Sure. So Firstly, crayfish are omnivores. They're primarily scavengers, although they will, grab small fish and snails and things when they can get them. I think just meat in general is a more effective source of protein in the wild. It's typically more nutritionally dense than vegetation. So I think that's the preferred food source when crayfish in general can get it. They like the animal protein. I have not heard of people using broccoli for bait before. That was surprising to me. But if it works, great. Like I said, rusty crayfish are omnivores. And so I don't think like they'll eat vegetation as well. But I think if they can get it, they prefer the animal protein food source. And then the second part of that question is kind of escaping me. Would you remind me, please?
Yeah, just how you came to choose the items that you chose to test.
Yeah, so this that is something that
Well, here, let me take this one.
yeah, take it away, Val.
So remember that the goal of this project was to find things that anybody could do. Right. And so we're looking for easy stuff, but also stuff that we thought would be most attractive to crayfish. So easy was hot dogs and then cat food. Cat food and dog food have been used as bait for stuff like this for eons. So that was a no-brainer. And then, but maybe they really want fish. So that's where I thought, well, we could buy frozen smelt or some frozen bait fish and try that. People could buy it. It's a little messier to deal with. So that's what we came up with, the bait choices. And then once we realized that we're omnivores, anything at least with a decent meaty smell in the water, that's what, because we did everything with meat. So, I mean, meat or fish, was going to attract them. Then we're like, well, hot dogs are easy. So let's just recommend hot dogs because they're easy. We weren't using dry kibble. We were using wet food, which, was pretty kind of a pain and messy to deal with, similarly as the frozen smelt started to thaw. That got messy to deal with. So hot dogs were easy. Ergo, hot dogs.
Perfect. Okay. A question about the refuge traps that you made. They're wondering if you made them yourself or if you purchased them, and if there is a technique that you might be able to use for them that would limit the chance of the crayfish kind of getting washed out as the trap is lifted or swimming out.
Sure, yeah. So we did make those. We didn't come up with the design. Like I said, there's some researchers out of Europe were using them to try to control a burrowing crayfish that is invasive over there. And so we thought, hey, let's give it a shot here because they found that the refuge shelters were better at targeting female crayfish. So we made them ourselves. And then the way that they worked, while the trap was set, the crayfish were free to come and go. But when you lifted the trap up, it would sit horizontal on the bottom of the lake. And then when you came by and picked up the trap, it's weighted on the backside here with some weights and a metal bracket. So it would tip up like this. Crayfish would be facing outwards towards the open water, and they can only swim backwards. So when you tip it up straight like that, it's really hard for them to get out. So we weren't losing very many crayfish that were able to escape as long as you pick it up swiftly. There were a couple instances where we did notice that as we were picking up one of the refuge shelters, a crayfish was able to get out. That didn't happen very often, just a couple of times. I think I could probably count them on one hand, the amount of observations that we had for crayfish getting out. As for a way to improve the refuge traps where that doesn't happen, perhaps you could make the tubes longer, and so the crayfish are further back set into the trap, but it's just then the material cost of building the traps is going to be higher. We haven't thought about that much yet, just because the refuge shelters were so bad comparatively at catching crayfish compared to the baited traps.
Right. Okay. Wondering next about if rusty crayfish tend to feed preferentially on wild rice or manumin compared to other aquatic plants.
I don't think we know that. I don't know that those sorts of studies have been done. We've thought about things like that and exclusions and things that it gets to be very difficult to do those sorts of things. Maybe there's some test somewhere where somebody's, dumped lettuce and this and that and the other thing in an aquarium and tried to see what they go after, but then that tends to be a pretty artificial situation as well. It we kind of suspect that as they're spreading throughout a lake and getting to really high densities, that they're just after whatever's out there. As Brennan said, we're catching a lot, we're catching hundreds. And they have a higher metabolism. They're bigger than our, how about metabolism, but they need to eat more because they're bigger than our other crayfish. And at high population densities, they're just going to eat whatever they can come across. And I think that's partly why the traps do so well. If you've got a trap that's giving off bait sent into the water, you're drawing crayfish from that, 20, 30 feet around there, and, traps would come up with just crawling with crayfish. We should show you some of the video. We should have thought to show you some of the videos, but it's entertaining.
Wow. Great. Okay. And then next, wondering if you could touch a little bit on how the trapping happening in June and July helps protect next year's growth of Manuman.
Yeah. So the idea behind that is that the second trip later in the summer, that's when the water is going to be the warmest. And there is a lot of literature that connects water temperature to crayfish activity, and it's pretty linear. As the water temperature gets warmer, the crayfish become more active. So the idea behind trapping at that time of year is that that's when you're going to be able to get the maximum amount of crayfish that are actively foraging and looking for food, and that's when they're going to be the most active, even just when they're not looking for food. When they're in colder water and over the winter and under the ice, they are not nearly as active. They're not exactly dormant, but they definitely slow down considerably.
So the idea is that you're getting them out of the wild rice area. Maybe wild rice is less vulnerable at that stage. That doesn't mean it's not invulnerable to crayfish. So you want to get them out of there, but also hopefully you're really reducing the crayfish population that's going to be in that area the next year, which would affect wild rice when it is very vulnerable. So it's sort of this, if you can really knock their populations back this year, then hopefully that will carry over into being protective for the next year. And this is important because if we went out too early in the spring, early summer, as Brennan said, when the water temperatures hadn't warmed up yet, we would see rusty crayfish. They weren't interested in eating yet. They wouldn't go into the traps. And so we caught very few rusty crayfish. So and then you might not be there. You might not be trapping at the time when they do start feeding and start knocking down wild rice. So again, it's that protection, knock them down as hard as you can when you can catch them. And then hopefully that protection carries over to the next year.
Got it. Great. Okay. It looks like we have time for one or two questions. We'll see how this goes. The next question was wondering about if you've seen or can talk about hybridization between rusty crayfish and native crayfish.
Yes, this was a difficulty that we encountered in the first year of the study in 2023. It honestly was pretty fascinating to observe, but in Garden Lake, which is near Ely, we were observing, and this is well documented as well in other lakes and some other lake systems. There's only a few confirmed locations where rusty crayfish are known to hybridize with natives, but in Garden Lake, the rusty crayfish were hybridizing with northern clearwater crayfish. And when you see the hybrids, they would exhibit physical characteristics of both kinds of crayfish. So you'd see maybe a faint rusty spot and then maybe also some physical identifiers for northern clearwater crayfish. But it wasn't a standard. It was kind of on a scale. Some looked more like rusty crayfish. Some looked more like northern clearwaters. And they were honestly hard to positively identify in the field. But they are known to hybridize with at least northern clearwater crayfish. I don't know if rusty crayfish are capable of hybridizing with other native species. But that hybridization is why we decided not to return to Garden Lake in 2024, just because it was difficult for our field teams to positively identify them one way or the other. when we did catch them, we counted them as invasive crayfish because they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be there without the rusty crayfish first being there. And the rusty crayfish, in the process of hybridizing, are also diluting the genetic pool of the native crayfish, which is something we don't want either. But it is possible. They do hybridize.
Great. Thank you so much to both of you. I'm going to advance this slide real quick for just the final wrap up. Thanks to everyone who joined us today to listen to today's webinar. As I mentioned, we are recording and this will be up on our YouTube channel. Give it at least a week and you'll also get an email when that is up. You can watch your inboxes too for an email notification. You should see a link to a survey come up when you exit out of Zoom, and we would greatly appreciate it if you took some time to respond to that survey and tell us about today's webinar. We also ask about, future things you'd like to hear about. I do have email addresses up on the screen as well. There were a number of questions that we didn't have time for. So if you'd like to reach out to either the research team for questions about this specific project or to us for more questions generally about the AIS Detectors webinar series or the program, I'd be happy to answer any of those questions. And I'm sure Brennan and Val would be happy to ask any or answer any other questions you have about the work they've been doing. And I think with that, I will let us go. Watch for the next webinar in, let's see, in July, I think, is our next one. And it's about zebra mussel management using low dose copper. You'll see a registration link for that that should start coming out as well. So thanks again to Val and Brennan. We really appreciate you sharing your time and all that you've learned with us today.
Yep, and just one more thing real quick. We will have step-by-step how-to instructions. I saw a lot of questions in the chat about, how many hot dogs do you need and how do you attach them and blah, blah, blah. We're going to have step-by-step instructions, should be on the web page on our Rusty Crayfish page of the MASERC website by the end of next week.
That's great. So if we'll keep an eye for that too, and if it's available, maybe we'll send that out along with the link for the recording too, and we can probably put that in the YouTube notes too. So thanks for adding that. Great. All right. Well, thanks again to both of you and to everyone who chose to join us today.
Thanks for tuning in.